You're listening to On Shifting Ground from the Commonwealth Club, World Affairs, and KQED. I'm Shireen Marisol Meraji, in for Ray Suarez.
This is America's border czar, and she's failed us. Under Harris, over 10 million illegally here.
Vice President Kamala Harris is flip-flopping on the border. If elected, Harris has vowed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on building a wall along the southern border. I wonder where she got that idea.
We are going to let people, and we want people to come into our country. A lot of people. We need them. We need them for jobs. We need them for everything. We want people to come in, but they have to come in through a process. They have to come in legally.
In the first half of this year, nearly $250 million was spent on campaign ads mentioning immigration. The most ad money spent on any issue, according to Ad Impact, an organization that follows campaign advertising. Most of those ads were anti-immigration, pro-Republican, and backed by conservatives. This, according to The Washington Post, which published a deep dive into 700 campaign ads that ran between January and June. The Washington Post found the ads, quote, inaccurately characterize immigrants as a threat, of which there is little evidence, unquote. Actually, there's quite a bit of evidence to the contrary. And you can find it in the new book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. The book's author is the regular host of On Shifting Ground, Ray Suarez, and Ray and I were recently in conversation at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco. On stage in front of a live audience, I shared insights from my work on NPR's podcast about race and identity that's called Code Switch. And I talked about some of my own personal experiences as a woman of Puerto Rican and Iranian heritage living here in the United States. Ray talked all about his new book, which takes us into the lives of American immigrants and teaches us about the complicated immigration policies responsible for our modern, multicultural, multiracial democracy. On today's show, you're going to hear some of the highlights from that conversation, and we're going to start with my question to Ray about what animated We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. You said you wrote this book in reaction to the Great Replacement theory. I would love for you to talk a little bit about why that inspired you to write We Are Home.
I read the Great Replacement Manifesto, which floats around in some of the darker corners of the internet. And it seemed to me to be one of the most un-American, ugly set of ideas that could be written by an American. Mm-hmm. And the Great Replacement theory works on the premise that secretly forces in society, Jews, are gaming immigration law, gaming legislative rules, and flooding the country purposely with non-white immigrants in order to replace the white population of the United States. Underlying this, or the foundation of it, is the belief that all good things that we have as a country have been made, developed, invented, thought of, advanced by white people. And that if white Americans are replaced as a percentage of the population, that's the beginning of the end of America.
Ray, I feel like this is absurd, absolute anti-Semitic bullshit.
Yeah, you could call that.
So why not ignore it?
Too many people believe it. Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's noxious. Yes, it's ugly. But if enough people believe it, you kind of have to pay attention to the fact that it's there. And the shooters in Poway, California, and in Pittsburgh, and in Buffalo, and in El Paso, men who went to kill lots of people in those places, when you look at their own personal writing and emails and internet traffic, it's fired up by the Great Replacement theory. So it's not a benign thing to have frustrated, disappointed people read this thing and say, I'm being cheated out of my birthright. which is to be in charge of this country, which is to be important, which is to know that if we make a line for some goodies that are being given out by society, I'm going to be at the front of the line. It's not just some wacky thing that some crazy right-wing person that they saw on TV is talking about. I mean, are you worried about this?
I am worried about
So it's not just me.
No. No, but sometimes I wonder if things that are so absurd and ridiculous, are we adding more oxygen by talking about them?
It's always a worry. Am I giving this thing more attention than it would get on its own? I came away from that deliberation sure that more people should know about this thing and know what's in it. They may have just heard the phrase, but never really thought too much about what was in it. They may have heard some YouTuber that they like talking about it, but never really read any of it. Don't be Great Replacement adjacent. Know what it is so you know what's going on.
You know, another thing you said is that you wrote this book in reaction to the national discourse on immigration, which was ahistorical. You know, people really didn't know the historical context and they didn't understand immigration policy. And I will say that as a journalist who has written stories about immigrants who have been affected by immigration policy, deeply affected, I think there definitely has been pushback from editors and gatekeepers who are not as interested in getting into the policy weeds. It's complicated, one. It's hard to make it interesting, and you have a very short amount of time. So it's like, let's center the human story and kind of ignore the policy bit or limit how much we talk about the policy bit. And personally, as a journalist, I think we're really doing our audience a disservice by leaving that out of the conversation. And then we get these national conversations around immigration that are ahistorical, that do go off the rails.
When I talk to people about the Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, I get a blank stare. They have no idea what it is. It's one of the most significant pieces of legislation of the entire Johnson administration, an administration which had tons of significant legislation. It gave us the America that we have now and the one that's coming in the 2040s. And its legislative champion in the U.S. Senate, Teddy Kennedy, and its champion in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, one of the ways they got recalcitrant Southern senators to vote for it was by telling them that it wasn't really going to change the country. They were wrong.
And talk about what that act did that changed the immigration system.
From 1924 to 1965, we had a set of laws in place that created formulas and quotas that favored Europe. So if you wanted to come to this country from Europe, you were in pretty good shape. If you wanted to come from anywhere else, it was significantly harder. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act pretty much throws open the door to the rest of the world. And, you know, there were small numbers of Indians, Pakistanis, Southeast Asians. They were here, but in very small numbers. Now we're talking about numbers in the millions, and Asian immigrants to the United States are the fastest growing category of people moving here from elsewhere on the planet. Black Americans may be surprised to find out that 1 out of every 10 Black people in the United States is an immigrant, which is a massive change from our history when Black people were the most uniformly native-born of all Americans, except for Native Americans, obviously. But 1 out of 5 Black people living in the United States is either an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. That is a remarkable change in a fairly short amount of time.
What's the adage? Change is hard. Sure, change can make us uncomfortable and anxious and fearful. But what Ray wants his readers who don't like change to understand is all the ways immigrants, specifically non-white immigrants, have kept this nation going. The ways immigrants of color are breathing new life into places that were withering on the vine.
In the book, I write about Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a town made famous by its reaction to immigrants and immigration. It was a fading small town in northeast Pennsylvania. 3 censuses in a row, it had a declining population, which is usually a bad sign. You had people of immigrant stock, the children and grandchildren of earlier European immigrants. Nobody in their families wanted their houses. It was that kind of situation. Dominicans were moving in from the New York City metropolitan area, and enterprising politicians used them as whipping boys and made Hazleton into a national cause célèbre in the anti-immigrant right. Dominicans have saved Hazleton. It has a growing population again. It doesn't have to close elementary schools anymore. It doesn't have an aging population. It has a revitalized commercial strip in the heart of downtown. But no matter how many times we learn this lesson, because we learn it over and over again, it never sticks. That was part of my frustration, because I suspected as I began to wool gather for this book that what was adding to the nasty buzz of it all was that now, in the post-1965 era, for the first time, the majority of immigrants to the United States were no longer white.
And instead of being lauded, these immigrants are being demonized. And like Ray said, that frustrates him. Another thing he's found frustrating is the seeming lack of interest so far in the part of his book where he writes about the rapid demographic change amongst Black people in the United States.
I wrote a whole chapter about it. It isn't getting the kind of play that I thought it would. I thought that there'd be a certain amount of gee whiz factor there, but it hasn't worked out that way yet.
Just wait. It'll happen. On Code Switch, we talked a lot about the tension between Black immigrants and African Americans who could trace their lineage to enslavement and how that's changing Black identity in the United States. Why do you think that statistic, that 1 in 10 Black Americans is an immigrant, isn't hitting in the way that you thought it would?
I think our conversation about race in general is so involved in other things right now that a conversation about the nature of Black America changing just isn't on anybody's menu. I don't entirely understand it. It was a big deal during the Cold War. Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower were really very intensely aware of the fact that the national news agencies of communist countries were showing newsreel footage in the global South of students being hit with fire hoses and having dogs set on them, of police cracking heads in the streets of southern cities, of buses being set on fire. To have maybe 1 or 2 generations removed from people sitting in Accra and Dakar and Addis Ababa and watching film of people being fire hosed and buses being firebombed and the 16th Street Baptist Church and all of that, and then want to move to the United States. Every African that I spoke to said, look, I knew about all of that, but America offered so much opportunity that I really wanted to try it out. One guy, Jabril from Senegal, said, I always wanted to move to America. America to them was also Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan. The most famous Black people on the planet are often, I wouldn't say always, but often Americans, even with our complicated and sometimes heartbreaking history.
Throughout the book, Ray examines why people continue to create a home in a country that hasn't been all that welcoming. He spends a lot of time with Samir, a Muslim of Yemeni heritage. Long story short, as a young adult, Samir moves to the United States and ends up enlisting in the Army.
He got his American education by being a soldier, and then by responding to the anti-Muslim sentiments after 9/11 and then the Muslim ban of the early months of the Trump administration. He stepped fully into his Americanness by making signs and grabbing his kids and going to protests. He was protesting the Muslim ban. He was proud of himself, proud that he was an American veteran and a citizen and speaking up against this law, and sort of fully, it was almost like there was an effervescing moment where finally the screen cleared and he felt really American, even when fighting against what he saw as an un-American law. It's kind of a
That's very
great
interesting.
moment.
That's the opposite of my father, who came as a Muslim from Iran in 1969. He was a student. And he doesn't talk very much about why he came and his feelings around what happened to him when he was here. But when the Muslim ban happened, my father said to me, "This is not the country that I wanted to come to. This is not the country that I thought it was." You know, I think it was just this passionate reaction. It wasn't like, I'm going to go out and protest because I'm an American. It was like him rethinking his decision to even come to this country.
The story of Islam in America over the last 40 years has been not exactly a happy story, but a fascinating one always. You know, there are Muslim populations across the country in places like Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and Norman, Oklahoma, and Jackson, Mississippi, wherever there are state colleges with engineering programs, because all these countries were sending over young men to get degrees in electrical engineering and petroleum engineering.
They used to call my dad Mohandas, engineer in Farsi, because he was the only one of his friends who didn't go to school for engineering.
But the oldest mosque in America is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And I write in the book about the experience of the imam in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, because that was his American education. The backlash after 9/11 against a congregation that had been there in Murfreesboro for decades. Middle Tennessee State University is there in Murfreesboro, so you get these young men, mostly, and eventually wives and children. The place was outgrowing its storefront and wanted to build a purpose-built mosque on the outskirts of town. Several of the members had done quite well. They donated the land and said, "Here, build the mosque." And they get ready to build it, ready to rock and roll. The city turns down their request for a permit. A lot of the people of Murfreesboro had jumped into action to block this mosque being built. Poor old Osama Balul, the imam in Murfreesboro, went to public information sessions. He tried to talk to members of the community who were opposed to the mosque being there. And in the process, learned about being an American. He was quoting the Constitution to me, quoting the Declaration of Independence. He married an American. He says, "My kids are American. This is my country." And he also was very funny. So when he went to one of these public information sessions, a line came up to the stage at the end, and people are coming by and thanking him for coming. And one woman approaches him, and he thinks she's about to shake his hand, so he puts out his hand, and she puts a bunch of pork sausages into his hand and says to him, "You're so full of hate that you even hate these pigs."
Imam Balul's response is priceless. Ray quotes him in the book saying, "Ma'am, we don't eat pigs. If any pigs are alive today, it's because of us. You guys are killing them and eating them. If anyone has a negative view of this animal, it's you, not me."
You could tell that his feelings had really been hurt. This was a hard thing for him to go through this. Here he was thinking that he was sort of a community guy. He had been working as an imam, and the congregation was growing, and he went to Chamber of Commerce things and he had a little profile. But now he was basically treated like a terrorist. And you could tell it hurt his feelings. And then I talked to him again more than a decade later,
He's in Nashville now.
he's in Nashville. He moved on to a bigger place. But also, he was philosophical about his experience and isn't full of regret. He's kind of glad that he went through all of this in a strange way. He said he learned so much. And I thought, well, I'm glad you're not bitter. I'm glad you feel that way.
My father is nearing the end of his life, and I think he is rethinking a lot of things. And there is some regret that's coming up, and we're having deeper conversations. And one of them is that, he wanted his children to be accepted and to assimilate. And he has a very thick accent, and Farsi is his first language. And he didn't teach us our heritage language. And my mom didn't do the same in Spanish. And I've been picking up a little bit of Persian here and there, and I'll talk to him over the phone, and he lights up. And I think one of his big regrets is not sharing his culture with us, and sharing his culture with us really for him meant sharing his language. And I think what he didn't recognize was that we never felt like we belonged. We never felt quite like we were these Americans that he really wanted us to be. They still name me Shireen Marisol Meraji. And people are still like, what are you? And then you say, well, I'm Iranian and I'm Puerto Rican. And then they're like, oh, you speak Persian? Do you speak Spanish? And then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm disconnected not only from my heritage, I'm also not really thought of as an American.
Caught between two stools.
And there's so many people that are just like me. I mean, I think multiracial Americans are the fastest growing Americans in the United States. I think that's something that you mentioned in the book. 25 million adults in the United States are children of immigrants. So they're going through some type of, I don't know if the feeling is shame because they're not as connected to their culture as they want to be, or guilt that they didn't do exactly what their parents wanted them to do when their parents sacrificed so much. I mean, I think there's like very rich conversations to be had around what it means to be a child of an immigrant in this country. On top of that, what it means to be a multiracial child of immigrants in this country. That's where the conversation is going next.
If there's any redemptive quality in that, I would say it's this. 2010 was the first year that in American maternity wards, a slight majority of people were born who don't trace their ancestry to Europe, but trace it instead to Africa, Asia, or Latin America. It's been true every year since then, so those kids are starting high school in September. They'll be starting college 4 years from now. They're growing up in an America where everybody's something. So I think we might be on our way to something different and something or even arguably better when it comes to the way we think about these things. I hope so. I feel hopeful.
There's something in this book that really made me feel something, and I want to read it. And this is about this feeling of being welcome here or not being welcome here. And there's a woman in the book named Dalia Mogahed, and she came to the United States from Egypt. She wears hijab, and you asked her if she felt less welcome in the United States of America post 9/11. And her response to you was really interesting. She says to you, Ray, you use the word welcome, and I like that you used it because it gives me a chance to say, I'm not waiting for a welcome. This is my home. If anyone has a problem with me being in my home, they are free to leave. But I'm not waiting for anyone's welcome because I'm not a guest here. Then she goes on to say, I push back on Muslims who talk about not feeling welcomed because it will create a paradigm in your mind where you are forever the guest to a host, and it's in an unhealthy way to think.
Yes, and Dahlia is tough and smart and needle sharp. And I was shifting in my seat a little bit. I mean, I thought it was a perfectly reasonable question. And I felt the desire to be welcomed from these people who told me their stories.
Yeah.
They wanted to just be regarded as neighbors and workmates and friends and all that. And Dahlia that was a very smart idea because she sees a power dynamic set up by the use of that word welcome, where someone else can put themselves in a position of being able to give you permission to be somewhere where you already belong.
I loved it.
That was a very good point. I still think immigrants want to feel welcome.
It's true.
But she's right that we don't have anybody who's a gatekeeper for you. There's a phrase that's being used now, heritage Americans or legacy Americans. That's the phrase Tucker Carlson uses.
Are we talking about Native Americans?
No, funnily enough, we're not. He means people who have been here long enough that they're really supposed to run the show. And the very strong sense that they are gatekeepers, that they get to say who belongs and who doesn't, that they get to say who is American enough and who's not, helps fuel that great replacement rhetoric, helps fuel that idea that someone else can decide for you whether you've done enough to be considered by them to be an American. The brass on those people is unbelievable, but they're actually being encouraged by people like Tucker Carlson. Once and for all, there is no such thing as a legacy American. If you're an American, you're American, and no one else can say you're not, or you're not like them, or you're not as American as they are. And thank God for that.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, Ray and I answer audience questions. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Ray, can you talk about why you embraced personal stories in your book? How was it a different experience for you?
This is my fourth book, and the previous three books were pretty conventionally told books by a journalist. Dive into archives, city records, and interviews too. But for this book, the longer I worked on it, the more I became convinced that instead of just being part of the story I tell, these personal stories have to become the core of the book, partially because they told their lives better than I could talking about them. It gave them the privilege of self-definition instead of retaining for me the privilege of definition, which a journalist always has or often has. But here they spoke for themselves and told their stories in ways that were surprising, shocking, amusing, all kinds of things. But they did it for themselves. And I'm glad my editor and I fought over this a long time, and we ended up with that. He was right. I was wrong.
Wait, so talk about the battle. What did you want to do with the book, and what was your editor? Your editor was pushing it to be more personal.
My first couple of chapters were pretty angry. It was an angry book.
Okay.
And he said, "Oh, don't write this angry book. I think there's another story here to tell. Tell that other stuff. Yeah, and it's in there. But it's not just that."
Got it.
So,
and he was right, you're
and he
saying.
was right. I think he was right, yeah. If Trump is reelected, just how dark will the next chapter of American immigration get? Well, depends on if he really means what he says. But I think there are a lot of people who, in principle, when they hear of mass deportation, they think, yeah, well, those people are breaking the law, they shouldn't be here, blah, blah, blah. But when they turn on the TV and see vans with people being dragged into them by uniformed agents of the state with their kids standing out on the sidewalk and screaming and crying, then it won't be abstract anymore. It won't be an abstract principle. What mass deportation would look like in a country that really means to do it is something that Americans could never countenance. I really believe that. So he says he's going to do it. I don't know if he's really going to do it, but if he tried to do it, I think it would horrify even many of the people who think that today, in principle, they're for it. Because what it would do, leaving empty houses on streets in cities all over the country, stores that don't open up tomorrow morning because their owner is in detention somewhere, shifts that aren't full because workers are gone now. We're not ready for that, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we are. Can you speak to why personal stories matter to conversations on race, immigration, and identity politics? What did you learn from code switch storytelling?
I learned that personal stories make policy real, but I always think, and we did this with Code Switch, is that we combined history and we combined policy with personal story. It makes these policies understandable when you see them through the eyes of a human being. I'll just talk about a story that I can't stop thinking about. I profiled 3 members of a family, the Gonzalez family, who all had different immigration status. So the youngest son, Jose Ventura, is an American citizen. He was born in the United States. One of the middle daughters, Abigail, she was completely undocumented. She hadn't filed for DACA before Jeff Sessions, during the Trump administration in 2017, said, we're not going to give DACA to new people, and we're going to get rid of DACA. And then Miriam Gonzalez, who was documented, she had DACA. And I talked to each of them separately about their experiences. And all of them said at the end of those interviews, we have never talked to each other about this. In the case of Jose Ventura, who is a citizen, all the pressure that he felt, that when he turned 21, he had to fix his family's papers, and that he had to make sure that he had a job that could support all of his family so that he could sponsor them so that they could be here legally and then get legal permanent residence. And he told me, every day I live with the pressure of trying to live up to a person who can do that for my family. And then Abigail, who had no documentation, was like, oh my God, I've lived in this country my entire life since I was 6 months, a baby, and I don't even really speak Spanish that well. And everyone's telling me that I don't belong here, this one place that I've ever known, and I could be deported at any moment because I don't have DACA. And then Miriam, who had DACA, who was older, talking to me about how much guilt she feels that she didn't force her 15-year-old sister to get DACA when she could have gotten DACA. And then Trump was elected, and then everything happened. And telling those stories from their different perspectives, one, tons of people who were listening were like, that is my experience in my life. And I have never heard my experience reflected in the national media. And it's just to be seen for the first time in the public, you know? So I think it did that. And also, they were able to say things that they had never said to each other to me. And that opened up a conversation amongst the 3 of them that they're hopefully continuing to have.
I will give you a little green room dish. Before we came out here, I said to Shireen that I'm tired of waiting for people to do the right thing for the right reason. I don't care if they do the right thing for the right reason. Even if they do the right thing for the wrong reason, that's okay, as long as they do the right thing. Mm-hmm. And there's real practical arguments about who's going to pick the cabbages and bust the tables and fight in the wars and do all the other things that we do as a society.
And take care of our aging population.
Huge. America is 14% foreign born, and the home healthcare workforce of this country is over 50% foreign born, which means that many people are going to spend the elderly, infirm years of their life in the constant company of someone that they wouldn't have even lived next door to.
Yep.
That person is going to bathe them, feed them, make sure they take their medicines properly, and cry at their funeral. We aren't talking about this or thinking about it at all.
I know, we've given you quite a bit to talk and think about when it comes to immigration and belonging in the United States. That was On Shifting Ground's host, Race Juarez, speaking with me, Shireen Marisol Meraji. I'm a journalist and assistant professor of race and journalism at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. And I'm going to let Ray take this next part.
You can get your hands on a copy of my new book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, at your local bookstore now.
I also have a new project I'd love to share with you, a podcast out right now called How I Get It Done. 20 in-depth conversations with women at the top of their game. I have an epic guest list. I'm going to drop a few names right here. Governor Gretchen Whitmer and I talked about her long battle to ensure reproductive rights in Michigan. Yvonne Orji, who's best known for her role as Molly on HBO's hit show Insecure, tells me why she defied her Nigerian parents to become a comedian instead of a doctor. And Orna Guralnik, the therapist from Showtime's Couples Therapy, talks about how cultivating a life of service means so much more than our elusive search for happiness. After a short break, I'm going to introduce you to one of the women featured in How I Get It Done. She was 2023's National Teacher of the Year. She taught 10th to 12th grade math at a big public high school in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And here's something she always told her students.
I see you, and you don't have to try to fit in here. You don't have to try to hide who you are. In fact, I want you to embrace your background. I want you to be proud of your heritage, and I want to learn from your culture.
And you may have guessed it, she's an immigrant. You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, a preview of my new podcast, How I Get It Done. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I stand in front of you with the name Rebecca Peterson, yet the name I was given at birth is Rebecca Mojde Kermanshahi, a beautiful intersection of my two family cultures, Rebecca, from my mother's Swedish heritage, Kermanshahi, and Mojde, from my father's Iranian heritage. My parents and I immigrated to the United States when I was young, and at 20, I finally became a U.S. citizen.
You're listening to a portion of Rebecca's speech at the White House Rose Garden, where she was honored as Teacher of the Year for the 2023-24 school year. I spoke to Rebecca for my new podcast, How I Get It Done, and I found what she had to say incredibly moving and inspiring. Let's listen to part of that conversation. We both grew up yearning, I think, for a real sense of belonging because we never quite felt like we fit in. You've said that you've compensated for all of that by, performing, striving, doing your very best, but all you really wanted was to be accepted for who you were. And I can totally relate to that. You are a Swedish-Iranian immigrant. You lived in 4 countries by the time you were 16. How has that made you who you are now?
Yeah, I grew up really all over the world, and yeah, I didn't see a lot of people like me, right? And that makes you really feel like you're on the outside. And when you're on the outside, you watch the inside so very closely. I compensated by fitting in. I thought I had to earn my way. I thought I had to earn my seat at the table by the grades I made, by the clothes I wore, by the way I talked. And it's not really healthy, right? Because you end up hiding a piece of yourself. And really what our souls are yearning for, I think, is to belong as we are, not to have to earn our spot. And so even though it was a little untethering to move so often and to not quite see people like me, it has come so full circle, Shireen, because my district that I now serve at is incredibly diverse. We have 3,100 kids, grades 10 through 12, and it is just so culturally rich. We have 62 languages represented in my district. And so I teach a lot of actually kids like me, honestly, like kids who are immigrants or kids who are bicultural or bilingual or first-generation Americans. And so to see that like this part of my story mattered, that I now get to say, I see you, and you don't have to try to fit in here. You don't have to try to hide who you are. In fact, I want you to embrace your background. I want you to be proud of your heritage, and I want to learn from your culture.
When Rebecca speaks, she alternates between talking about what she's teaching her students and what she's learning from them. There's always a give and take. And she admits, teaching didn't come naturally. Being a student was her comfort zone. She loves learning. After college, she got a master's degree in math and wasn't ready to stop being a student, but she needed to take a little break before going back to get her PhD. And during that break, Rebecca ended up teaching a math class at a public high school, teaching calculus.
And oh, man, it was a shock. It was such a shock to my system. It was like, yeah, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have a degree in teaching. I had 2 degrees in math, right? And so I had one foot out the door. I was back to applying to PhD programs. I was looking at private schools. I just really didn't think I was going to make it. I just thought, like, this is too hard. I can't get their attention. I thought, my God, if I have to teach how to graph a line one more time, like I might lose it. And then I stumbled upon this new community blog called One Good Thing, and it was a group of, I think, just math teachers. At the time, it was a really small group of us initially that just started committing to writing good things that happen in the classroom. And we live by this mantra that every day may not be good, but there's one good thing in every day. And that quote really resonates with me because it doesn't take away the demands of my job, right? Every day may not be good, but it does insist on taking ownership of my day. And so one day I pulled up the blog's platform, I wrote one good thing and hit publish. And the next day I wrote one good thing again and hit publish again. And the third day I did the same, and I just kept going and going and going.
That first year, is there a story from the classroom that you look back on and you're like, whoa, that year was challenging? Was there a particular student? Obviously, you're not going to say names, but can you share with me something concrete about what it was like in that classroom that very first year for you?
Yeah. I kept getting these students, like new students throughout the year, and I was realizing they were coming from like other teachers that other teachers didn't want. And I remember this one student came from another teacher. I think he had been violent in her class. Then they put him in my class, and it was really hard to get him to work. Like, he's just really, I like almost had to like force him to pick up the pencil type of thing, right? Like, have my paper, have my pencil, I have all my supplies. Like, please just write down the quadratic formula. And one day he just absolutely refused, and he started kind of like shaking his desk and like pounding it. And I thought, oh, this could go wrong real fast. And he stormed out.
Mm-hmm.
And I went home that day. I was like really unsettled. I was really unsettled. I really didn't want to go back to work the next day. I was afraid. And I had gotten into this habit of writing something good. And it just dawned on me, like, maybe this kid has never had anyone see the good in him. And so I got out like a little greeting card, and I said, I know yesterday was rough, and I don't know if I did something, and if I did, I hope we can talk about it. But whatever it was, I hope you know that you are good, that like I'm here, I'm in your corner, and I gave that card to his first hour teacher and asked them to deliver it to him, and I didn't have him until like 5th hour after lunch. And Fifth hour started and he was nowhere to be found. And 5 minutes passed and I think 10. And finally he strolls in, his usual tardy self and sits down. And we didn't say anything. But that day, he worked.
Focusing on the good, one good thing, got Rebecca through that first year of teaching and beyond. She's done it nearly every school day for the past decade. And when we spoke, she was up to 1,400 blog posts and counting.
Yeah, it changed me. And it's so small. But that's why I try to tell people, don't underestimate the small things because it's going to feel and the math shows us this, if we increase even just by 1% every day, it feels so slow at first. It feels horizontal, right? It feels like we're not moving. But if we just keep at it, we're actually experiencing exponential growth. And I just think, what a shame had I stopped writing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have experienced that growth.
Mm-hmm.
It just shines a light on how kind of messy this work as teachers can be. And that, we do our best and sometimes we get beautiful, happy endings and sometimes we don't. But sometimes we get some really beautiful middle pieces. We have to tuck those pieces into our hearts. We have to let them sustain us because this is really difficult work. And if we don't make space for the good things to land, we'll burn out so fast.
That's really good advice.
Can I show you a little bit of what we do with these fractions in calculus in high school? Would that be okay? Okay.
Being National Teacher of the Year means that Rebecca spends a lot of time traveling across the country meeting fellow teachers. So when we spoke, she was taking a break from her calculus class. She missed it so much that sometimes she subbed in for different teachers just for fun. We followed her around last spring when she was subbing for Mr. Parsons' 4th grade math class. The lesson that day was fractions.
So I'm going to start with this side of the number line with 1/2. I'm going to keep, for this sequence, I'm going to keep the numerator. What do I mean by numerator? What do you think, Noah?
It's the number that's on top.
The top number of the fraction. I'm going to keep the numerator 1. And the denominator, I'm going to increase by 1 each time.
Though Rebecca normally teaches high school, she told us she loves teaching elementary students because it reminds her of how many ways kids can approach a problem.
What questions do you have for me so far? What do you think, Ellie?
This is a little random, but do you set, if it was 1.33, how do you say it? Do you say it with the point or the and?
I say 1.3.
Okay. Because Mr. Parsons always tells us to say
Does he?
and. He's 1 and 3/10.
Oh, 1 and 3/10. That's also fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, some of the teachers say and the others say point.
Yeah, here's a secret. Oh, we're going to get the lazier.
Another piece of advice Rebecca shared with me was something she learned how to do to get disparate groups of students to first trust her and then to trust each other in the classroom. She uses the power of storytelling. It's very obvious in what I do. I'm a journalist. I go out and I ask people what their stories are for a living. You're a math teacher and you do the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And why has that helped your students in math, do you think?
So a few years ago, I started this new introduction. It's called Unit 0, the Calculus of Connection. And after I shared my story, I invited my students to come share their story. And they signed up for time slots, before school, after school, during lunch. No agenda, just tell me whatever's, whatever you want about you, about your family, about your pets, whatever. Because kids spell love Time. It's so important to carve out this time and this space to say, you matter first and foremost as a human being. Yes, you're my student, but first and foremost, we're both humans. And so it's just a way I kind of humanize math class. And it takes a good 10 weeks, right, to sit with over 100 teenagers one-on-one. But once those 10 weeks are over, I don't know how else to say it, Shireen, other than there's this atmospheric shift in the classroom. It is palpable. There is this peace, there's this trust, and there's the sense that we belong to each other, right? And so my kids take more risks academically. They ask more questions. They know that mistakes are proof that we're trying. They know that we don't say, I don't get it. We say, I'm not quite there yet, you know? And I truly believe that all stems first and foremost through making space for their stories.
And it's working.
And it's working. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have about an 88% pass rate on the AP exam. The state pass rate, whoa.
You got excited. Like, this is exciting.
I got real excited. The state pass rate is about 45%. So we're almost double the state pass rate. And my students, a lot of them don't come from wealth, like statistically, they should not be making these scores. They should not be outperforming the rest of the state to this magnitude. But I refuse to let them be a statistic.
Is there a story that you tell often from your childhood because you can see that it really moves your students, that it really penetrates, their very cool high school exteriors?
I had some amazing teachers, some incredible teachers. And I had some teachers that didn't instill like that pride for my heritage that I hope I instill. And so one that I will sometimes say is just like, I had actually two male teachers who they would call everybody else by their last name, right? Like Mr. Jones, Miss Smith. I never got to be Miss Kermanshahi, I was always Rebecca. Or if they attempted it, the class would laugh and the teacher would kind of like join in on that laughter. I say that to tell my students that our names matter and that I want to learn your name because your name and what you want to go by, like that informs who you are. And that's the first part of your story. That's how we introduce ourselves, right? That's the beginning of the chapter. And while maybe they don't all have like, what people said was a funny last name, there's something in that they can each relate to, that the beginning matters.
Rebecca, I have loved every moment of this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Same. Thank you for making the space to elevate a teacher's voice.
Rebecca Peterson's now back in Tulsa, Oklahoma, teaching teachers as a teacher leadership specialist for the same school district. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by me, Shireen Marisol Meraji. It was mixed and mastered by Mateo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. And our host is Ray Suarez, and he'll be back next week. Don't forget to check out my new podcast, How I Get It Done, for more inspiring interviews like the one we just heard from Rebecca. You can find it on Audible. Thanks for listening.